See that's going. Almost 50 in the room, so I think we're going to get started, everybody. First, we're just going to do some quick housekeeping. Tonight's talk is going to be about an hour long, followed by a Q&A. You will be asked to put your questions in the chat, preceded by a queue. And so we'll be moderating and bringing your questions out. Hopefully I need you to speak to your points. This talk is being recorded, as you just heard, and will be available in the coming weeks. If you do not wish to be recorded, please feel free to keep your camera off. And to be notified when that's available, or generally to stay in touch, please follow our social media channels. Stop sharing real quickly. And now that that's out of the way, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to Transceiver, a monthly talk series hosted by New School Policy and Design for Outer Space, or NSPDOS as we like to call it. I have to thank Nick Travaglini, who's here in the room, for launching this venture, and the entire crew for their many hours of work on this. A few words on NSPDOS. A new student organization here at the New School. We have formed during times of rapid change, and I, for one, can say how much the camaraderie and critical thought has contributed to my work over these months. A chapter of SEDS, an international student organization, we develop projects for research into near and distant future design problems off Earth. Rather than fleeing the present, we are committed to combating escapism and to considering the social, political, and cultural systems implicated by any journey off of this Earth. Welcoming transdisciplinary scholarship, we encourage students from across the university and beyond to join us. We will be holding an open meeting for those interested this Saturday, the 12th at 3 p.m. Eastern. Please get in touch about that. And with that, I'd like to hand this off to my friend and colleague, Weston Finfor, who will be introducing tonight's speaker.
Thank you, Colin. Hello, everyone. It's with great pleasure that we get to introduce Ed Keller as our keynote and inaugural speaker for our Transceiver Speaker Series. In many ways, this research group would not have existed without him. A few of us students first met in his post-planetary design course hosted at Parsons in fall 2019, and I think we were really just blown away by the excitement and the curiosity that he brought to every class. The topics and questions we explored in post-planetary design planted the seeds for the work we will continue to undertake here in NSPDOS. Ed is an architect, theorist, musician, and is the co-founder of AUM Studio with Carla Leitao. He was also the director for the Center for Transformative Media, where he hosted numerous conferences ranging in scope from the future of guitar design, the landscapes of cognitive capitalism, AI and blockchain, future of mind, as well as an infamous symposium on cyclonopedia. Ed was most recently associate professor at Parsons, and we are very grateful that he still offers his time and expertise to us today. Thanks, Ed. Turning it over to you.
Thank you so much, Weston. Can everybody hear me? Yeah, I'm going to go to a screen sharing, and then I'm going to drop into the presentation, and hopefully everything will run smoothly. Weston, can you see this, and can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
Okay, very good. I have my, by the way, I have my cell phone on, so if for some reason I'm speaking into the void and I don't notice it, just drop me a text message. So let me begin. The talk will be about an hour. First, I have to acknowledge many people before I begin talking. I want to thank the New School Policy and Design for Outer Space, Colin McLean, Ray Rosenthal-Bohm, Jamie Boyd, Weston Finfor, Nick Travaglini, Cato Trieu. Thank you so much for forming the group, for your enthusiasm. A million thanks for the invitation to do an inaugural talk for you. It's an incredible pleasure and an honor. I also want to acknowledge folks over the past few years who were great supporters of both the Center for Transformative Media between 2012 and 2020, and also my post-planetary design seminar, which ran for I think roughly the same amount of time. There were outside events where the ideas I'm going to present to you tonight were refined. The Machines That Matter Super Conversations conference with eFlux and the New Center in 2015. I think that was the first time I attempted to map out some sketch of cosmopolitics, different forms of cosmopolitics, the Border Sessions conferences in The Hague in 2018. Again, I spoke along these lines, talks for Strelka, many seminars and workshops at Arts, Letters, and Numbers, the para-academic group that was founded by David Gersten in upstate New York, and so forth. So there's countless moments when I've been able to refine these ideas or at least extrapolate on them. So I send my thanks out to everyone. Also to specific people who've been encouraging over the past decade or so, Nandita Biswas-Malamphy, Rory Rowan, Peter Watts, Kim Stanley Robinson, Stephen Chaviro, Benjamin Bratton, Stephanie Wakefield are a few people that come to mind for support, for inspiration, for joining our events, for inviting me to their events. And of course, thanks especially to Carla Leitao and all of our conversations and work together for more than 15 years. And I think back now to 2013 and the Planetology Design Studio. I was very lucky to co-teach with Carla at RPI then. It was one of her many amazing planetology design studios and seminars, which she has run at the Crave Lab at Rensselaer. So thank you, everybody. Let me launch into this talk. When I was discussing last week with Weston what might be appropriate, we talked a little bit about a universalist model as a theme, and questions of scale came up. What would constitute a design prompt that would allow us to deploy general models that are useful for both theorists, designers, technologists? How might we design across a range of different scales and link those design moves or those critical analytical moves back to universalist models? I'm fully aware of the pitfalls of offering universalist models, so I will problematize that throughout this talk. But you should come into it with the assumption that I'm both serious about universalist models, but I also recognize the dangers of attempting to propose them. And of course, in all cases, across the design opportunities or examples or case studies that I look at tonight, we should always ask what policy is appropriate to explore and to deploy. And I use the term policy interchangeably across disciplines: software development, law, politics, culture, et cetera, et cetera. So we could start with an image from Dune, any of the films that are adaptations of the novel. Weston and I spoke about that last week, but instead of starting with an image from Dune, I will start with this image by Mark Tansey. Now, standing behind all of this is the example of Frank Herbert's Dune, the novel, and the opportunity to explore what ecological languages, and as Weston pointed out to me last week, what structures need to be in place to guarantee the outcomes that one desires as a designer. Dune is a fantastic case study, looking at many different scales across literally thousands of years of culture, religion, belief system, engagement with computation, engagement with planet management and terraforming. And much of this talk tonight can be seen through the lens that the novel Dune provides us. Most poignantly, of course, the terraforming part of the project. Dune, desert, planet, as a way to frame universal questions. And I'll touch on the desert as a theme a number of times tonight. But really, coordination is at the core of the talk tonight: the success of coordination and the failure of coordination. So I could show images again from film adaptations of Dune, but I show this image by Mark Tansey to underscore the problem of the failure of coordination. And as I often do when I show this image, I will read you the poem by Percy Bysshe Shelley, Ozymandias. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear: my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away." So in thinking about design for permanence, or design for coordination, or design for empire, I suppose one could ask the question, is it better to design soft systems, laws, cultures, or to design hard systems, infrastructures, cities, buildings? This is a general outline of the talk tonight. I've just covered the situation. I'll quickly unpack some key concepts. I'll go through an engagement with the problem of models, I'll unpack a range of different scales and try to insert a few design opportunities at each scale. Talk about coordination, talk about the general economy and the planet, talk about the 1970 study limits to growth, questions of governance that emerge both then and now. Talk about platforms at a planetary scale, structures of feeling, to borrow a term some of you may be familiar with from Raymond Williams. Talk about recursivity, both in systems, physical systems, broader ecological systems, but also cognitive systems. And finish with a brief engagement with a few forms of cosmopolitics across the spectrum and the gesture and the role of the gesture. If I had to pull a few key concepts out, one would be planetary coordination or post-planetary coordination, what it means to think systems and design across various scales, what the function of recursivity and bootstrapping might be, what it means to think thought as not thought through recursivity, the problem of sapience, sapience after sentience, and what kinds of mind we can imagine through those varying forms of recursivity, both neurological, neurophysiological, but also simply material, planetary. And then finally, the cosmopolitical gesture. And I'll talk a number of times about what I mean by gesture. What about models? Well, let me refer to Carl Schroeder's concept of thalience. Schroeder says this in talking about thalience and offering thalience as a model beyond science. What if you could separate the activity of science from the human researchers who conduct it? Automate it, in fact. Imagine creating a bot that does physics experiments and builds an internal model of the world based on those experiments. It could start out as something simple that stacked blocks and knocked them over again. Later models could get quite sophisticated. And let's say we combine this ability with the technology of self-reproducing machines, von Neumann machines. Seed the moon with our pocket protector brandishing AIs and let them go nuts. Let them share their findings and refine their models. Now, Schroeder develops this concept of thalience in one of his hard science fiction novels titled Ventus. Very, very long book, unpacking it indirectly. In his short text on thalience, he continues to unpack it much more clearly and directly. He says, this little thought experiment is an attempt to give the physical world itself a voice, so that rather than us asking what reality is, reality itself can tell us. It is possible that thalient systems will always converge on a model of the universe that is comprehensible to humans. The last definition of thalience involves the exciting possibility that, yes, multiple equally valid physical models of the universe are possible, not one true theory of everything, but many, perhaps an endless number of them. Now, I would drop this idea of a radically open ontology and the concept of thalience back into a trajectory that moves from non-awareness to sentience, to sapience, which is awareness of awareness, if you will. And so the entire problem of models I set up in the context of Carl Schroeder's definition of thalience. And so in a compelling way, the salient form of science, and we could say massive addressability, to borrow a term from Michael Whitmore, that Schroeder foresees could be a way that a general economy, in the Georges Bataille sense, might be achieved. In fact, the opinions of systems, of agents in systems, would be equivalent to or take precedence over the point of view of the human. There's a twofold challenge here. First, I'd argue that for us to continue as humans ethically, ecologically, we must understand the radically non-human point of view. And of course, this is something that many people have been talking about in recent years, so that we can reimagine empathy from a human and a non-human perspective and develop modes of action in that light. But second, I'd argue that we may have no choice. As this century unfolds, it may well be that emerging AI, new forms of life, new forms of the artificial give us no choice but to accept their points of view. So how to begin? Let's start with this idea of a range of different scales in space and a range of different scales in time, from the very, very small to the very, very large. And as we go across this, let's ask a few questions. What is a natural or artificial system at scale? A natural or artificial intelligence at scale? What lives or operates at each scale? What aspect, part, or whole of the human and the inhuman thinks and acts at each of these scales? Are there universals of intelligence that can be mapped and extrapolated? You could insert their universal laws or universal rule sets or general rule sets. At the scale of the planet or the scale of a part of the planet, can cities and forests think? If so, what kind of intelligence is afforded them across what time scales? Does our planet have a mind or computational capacity? What might constitute a cosmic commons, and what alternate cognitive frameworks might we need to map it? And of course, does and should anything human make it out of the near future? So if we use a few scales physically that you'll recognize immediately, imagine the scale of the meter, 10 to the 1, 10 meters. Scale up, 10 to the 3rd, a kilometer. Scale up more, 10 to the 6th, 1,000 kilometers. 10 to the 7th, almost Earth's diameter at 12,700 kilometers. All the way up to the Earth to the Sun, 150 million kilometers, 1 astronomical unit. And the heliopause, the kind of limit of our sun's protective magnetic shield around our solar system, anywhere from 125 to 180 AUs from the sun. And think about the scale in time using the second as a baseline. 10 to the 3rd, 1,000 seconds, 1 kilosecond, 16 minutes. Of course, I'm riffing on the Eames's power of 10 here with this delivery. 10 to the 6th, just over 11 days, 270 hours a megasecond. 10 to the 9th, a gigasecond, 31 years. 10 to the 11th, 3,169 years. And a terasecond, 1 terasecond, which should be familiar to all of you because you all have terabyte hard drives now. 1 terasecond is 31,690 years. So let's think about bodies and gestures. What happens at 1 meter in 1 second, the human body? What are the limits of perception, action, and thought at this scale? What's a physical gesture at the scale of the meter? What creatures exist at that scale? A dog, but also a nervous system, a small tree, a cluster of fungi, a swarm of insects. The rings of a tree 1 meter in diameter. They hold meaning for humans to interpret, to count. Animals may interpret those rings as well. Wasps, which are attempting to lay their eggs on larvae inside the tree. The indexical meaning of the ring of the tree, the worms, the woodpeckers, etc. Now, of course, 1 meter, 1 second is not a hard fixed correlation. It could be 1 meter, 1,000 years, if we're talking about trees. Let's consider at the scale of 1 meter in a city, the New York City Department of Environmental Protection Sampling Station. This is a 19th century artifact that is deployed across 900 some odd sampling stations in New York City. These are cast iron sentries, if you will, a siphon sipping from the vast network of lines which supply the city's millions of inhabitants. This is a place to search for bacterial and chemical contaminants, to monitor downstream any potential problems within the system. The deployment of these stations reflects what cities learned from Snow's analytical methods developed in his maps of the London cholera outbreak of 1854, showing an epidemiological connection to a contaminated water supply. Now, is this really a meter? Is it a second? It's roughly 1.5 meters. It's not a second because the water has come for days from reservoirs far upstate and outside of the city. It shows at the human scale, a point of contact with the vast scales that New York City operates at, with a reach across the region, the economic, the political systems, which this one resource, water, knits together into an infrastructural ecosystem. Let's think at the scale of cities and forests, 1 kilometer, 1 kilosecond. I asked the question, can cities and forests think? What are trans-individual systems, collectives, colonies of animals, ecosystems, yes, but cultures also, music, art, literature, film, AR, VR. What, on the way to 1 kilometer, what is it operating at the scale of 100 meters? Well, certainly a Saturn V rocket, a very large tree, a redwood, a whale, 100 meters. Smaller spaceships, large buildings, skyscrapers. Again, a kilosecond, 16 minutes. What operates across that time scale? What lives, thinks, or interacts at that time scale? Jumping up 10,000 kilometers, 10 megaseconds, planets and infrastructures. Does a planet have a mind or computational capacity? If so, what kinds of information processing takes place? What networks are folded into that? How do we work as designers to access those flows of information and energy? Systems, cybernetics, government and network as intelligence, geology as computation. Our planet itself indexically thinking. Material systems bundle together different temporalities. The Earth has registers of massive addressability in the river meanders across hundreds of thousands of years. At a geological scale, driven by planetary forces across millions, billions of years, plate tectonics. And at an astronomical scale, meteor strikes, the Sudbury meteor. As Elizabeth Ellsworth and Jamie Cruz say in writing about the Sudbury Basin, quote, when the meteor, approximately 10 kilometers wide and traveling at speeds over 89,000 miles per hour, impacted Sudbury, things changed globally. It might have registered 10.2 on the Richter scale, or 10 billion Hiroshima bombs. The force of the collision is incalculable. The Precambrian shield was punctured so deeply, it has not yet been learned whether the nickel found in Sudbury was present in the meteorite, or whether it was splashed up from the molten bowels of the Earth. So how do we intervene as designers? We build infrastructure, we build railway systems, we take advantage of the metals the planet is assembled from, we try to gain control. Look back a century to before World War I, the Berlin to Baghdad Railway, partially completed in fact, amazingly. Its completion was terminated when World War I broke out. It was part of a European empire building initiative. Middle Europe stretching out into the Middle East, which we can now see a century later as a deeply contested kind of project. The FOAM Cryptospatial Coordinates project, which if I remember correctly emerged from a team at Strelka, says of their form of infrastructure, quote, we introduce a new fundamental part of our work, the cryptospatial coordinate, an open and interoperable standard for location in Ethereum smart contracts. The FOAM CSC is the starting point for this shared location standard, allowing any smart contract to make an immutable claim to an address on the blockchain and a corresponding location on the map. So these are attempts that we're making as designers, as technologists, to take control of some of those forces. Let's jump down in scale to the millimeter and the millisecond, the bacterial and the neuronal. Collective intelligence can be mapped across populations of humans or ecosystems. What if we apply these to the microscale and to smaller temporal dimensions? To what degree might we compare the intelligence of a bacterial colony or a microbiome with the functioning of a CPU or a network of millions of computers? Design of a blood cell, design of the mitochondrion, design of a system of gut flora, design of a grain of sand, design of a pixel. And scales of time, 1 second, 10 to the negative 3, a millisecond. Now, milliseconds seem like they're quite small, but actually you can perceive milliseconds. 100 to 400 is a blink of your eye, but about 10 milliseconds latency is enough for you as a musician and sometimes a non-musician to hear that something funky is going on with the music. So for any of you who use digital musical interfaces connecting to your computers and you have latency problems, you know very well that above 10 milliseconds you start getting thrown off. You can perceive 10 milliseconds, and even less. Drummers can perceive maybe 3 or 4 milliseconds quite clearly. How does the sub-millisecond, how does the sub-millimeter operate when we drop down to the viral, the atomic, the rapitronic, the micro, the nanometer? How do these profoundly non-human scales of space and time connect back to the life worlds of humans, of cultures, of ecosystems, of planets? The scale of the bacteriophage, the microsecond, 1 microsecond, the time to execute 1 machine cycle by an Intel 80186. Or in this video, payloads of molecules inside these blue circles you see moving along membranous nanotubes in a cell, illustrating how they might be transmitted to a cell in need of them. Even faster, 10 to the negative 6, a microsecond, 10 microseconds, cycle time for 100 kilohertz radio wavelength, 3 kilometers. Fascinating number, 77.8 microseconds, a fourth, a 60th of a 60th of a second, used by Al-Biruni and Roger Bacon in the year 1000 and 1267 AD respectively. How do these timescales and physical scales actually operate? I turn to Sadie Plant and her amazing text on tulip mania and viruses. She writes, viruses are largely judged in negative terms. Like all such oddities, they are seen as mistakes, spanners in the works, bugs in the system. More often, however, they are so mixed up with the lives of their hosts that it is almost impossible to judge them as anything other than vital elements of the systems they traverse. So viral DNA transport laterally across populations, might that be a form of computation? What kind of computation? Well, when Sadie Plant writes about tulip mania, it's an economic and a cultural and a viral and a plant computation simultaneously. So the distinctions between technology, design, artifice, and life or nature become entangled. This is what Sadie Plant says about tulip mania. Quote, when they were introduced to Holland in the early 17th century, tulips found an eager audience in what was already a highly cultured world. Northern Holland has been described as Europe's first modern economy, and people certainly had the money and the sensibility to pursue the exotic and treasure the rare. How does this clarify the connections between life forms, ecosystems, human desires, economies, and even infrastructures? Individual bulbs began to attract extremely high prices. Trading was frenetic, ridiculous even, as bidders raised prices beyond all reason. Bulbs began to function as a currency, and options were traded hundreds of times on futures markets while they were still maturing in the ground. So, as I've said in discussions with many of the post-planetary discussion groups over the years, is the virus thinking in the way that a human is thinking? No. Is the virus aware that it's inflecting human economies? No. Are the humans aware now that the virus was inflecting? Now we are, but at the time they were not aware it was a virus. Nonetheless, there's an entanglement taking place there, where there is a series of effects cascading through the system. Let's jump down to the even smaller and faster. A nanometer, a nanosecond. 1 nanosecond, cycle time for a 1 gigahertz processor. 20 to 40 nanoseconds, the time of fusion reaction in a hydrogen bomb. Can we design for that scale? Well, we build hydrogen bombs, sure, but we've also built, more than 50 years ago, the Rapitronic camera, a high-speed camera capable of recording a still image with an exposure time as brief as 10 nanoseconds. That image, which looks like a flower blooming, is actually an atomic explosion captured just nanoseconds into its explosion. And so, yes, we can design actually for those time scales and those physical scales. And then we can think out in scale again to the very, very large. From the Earth through galactic superclusters to the observable universe. So, coordination. How could we take on this problem of coordination? It's related to the question of harnessing material systems and energetic systems that I've been unpacking with the scales examples. Robin Hanson, in his text, The Rapacious Hardscrapple Frontier, where he attempts to take on a question of human expansion out across our galaxy, says this, quote, the familiar biological world contains only local coordination. Genes can coordinate within a body and creatures can coordinate within a tribe, but on larger scales, genes, creatures, and tribes compete for scarce resources with little coordination. We humans today coordinate our actions via markets and governments. Will our descendants coordinate more than we do? Now, this is a question that Robin asks in the context of humans moving in many different directions across the galaxy. And the kind of remit of the question he's asking is to say, well, how will humans still engage other humans as we go across time, as we expand out over thousands of years into the near star field and into the larger galaxy? What will be the mechanism of coordination? What feedback loops will allow that coordination to take place? Well, we could rewind to the 1990s and the Biosphere Project and all of the ways that it attempted to map out a set of feedback loops that when they reached scale would be self-sustaining. We can also look back to the late 1960s, Anna and Lawrence Halprin and their RSVP cycles project, which was deployed both across theatrical and dance performances, but also landscape design and ecological design. And the RSVP cycles are a set of feedback loops in rehearsals, performances, and refinements. So the model of the feedback loop is picked up and deliberately redeployed carefully to tune the performance of the system. We can jump back farther to 1962 and Ballard's novel, The Drowned World, where Ballard claims that we are byproducts of, as one of his characters says, quote, the oldest memories on Earth, the time codes carried in every chromosome and gene. Every step we've taken in our evolution is a milestone inscribed with organic memories, from the enzymes controlling the carbon dioxide cycle to the organization of the brachial plexus and the nerve pathways of the pyramid cells in the midbrain. Each a record of 1,000 decisions taken in the face of a sudden physical chemical crisis. What is Ballard saying here? Well, the sudden physical chemical crisis is an organism millions of years ago encountering a challenge in its environment. And 1,000 decisions are what happens in that organism's body when it tries to negotiate the landscape of this challenge that it's been presented with. Ballard is essentially saying, our bodies have carried forward across tens, hundreds of millions of years, a clear memory of those specific decisions. And some of the mechanisms that were born in those challenges are still operating physically in us today. These are feedback loops that have self-sustained across eons. Ballard continues to say, his character continues to say, the brief span of an individual life is misleading. Each one of us is as old as the entire biological kingdom, and our bloodstreams are tributaries of the great sea of its total memory. Now, this is rhapsodic, maybe it's beautiful, maybe it sounds kind of exciting and friendly, but it can go in very dark directions. Ultimately, the problem, one of the problems for us, is identifying mechanisms which technically colonize our perceptions and change the way we're able to think ourselves in relation to the world. Those biological challenges that Ballard maps out are related to psychophysical challenges as well. Antonin Artaud wrote this in Theater and Its Double. Artaud said, quote, if music affects snakes, it's not on account of the spiritual notions it offers them. In other words, the snakes don't understand the concept of the music. But because snakes are long and coil their length upon the earth, because their bodies touch the earth at almost every point, and because the musical vibrations which are communicated to the earth affect them like a very subtle, very long massage. And I propose to treat the spectators like the snake charmer's subjects and conduct them by means of their organisms to an apprehension of the subtlest notions. Now, Artaud was a revolutionary performer, theatrist, actor. And this is a concept offered toward revolution. But at the Nuremberg rally site designed by Speer in the 30s, that exact concept of affect, that exact concept of the very subtle long massage, that conducting by means of their organisms, was deployed equally in service of what we could call a dark cosmopolitics. Artaud's insight was hijacked by Speer and deployed into a dark cosmopolitics to control millions of minds, millions of bodies, millions of feelings, to create a structure of feeling precisely hijacking that mechanism. But can we think optimistically about this? Cities have always been stubbornly resistant, low entropy computational systems. Ruskin's comments in Stones of Venice suggest that the city itself is an index of the mixing of flows of cultures. Ruskin uses geological metaphors to discuss this. Quote, the glacier stream of the Lombards and the following one of the Normans left their erratic blocks wherever they had flowed, but the lava stream of the Arab, even after it ceased to flow, warmed the whole of the northern air. And the history of Gothic architecture is the history of the refinement and spiritualization of northern work under its influence. What are we looking at here? This film of Venice, we're looking at those flows which over 1,000 years cross-fertilized and hybridized with each other. Ruskin uses the seeming metaphor of glaciers and lava flows. But Ruskin isn't using them just as metaphors. Ruskin is imagining the flows of bodies and cultures operating literally like glaciers and lava streams. And so each of these design moments function as points of contact, as points of inflection and control or loss of control in the broader construction of a set of feedback loops. Another way to rethink the question of the relation between these feedback loops, a wider, almost ecology of technologies and nature, would be to situate it in the investigation opened by Bataille in The Accursed Share, where he proposed that we should not isolate systems completely, that only a model of a general economy would be detailed enough to allow us to grasp the processes of the world. As Bataille says, quote, "The economy taken as a whole is usually studied as if it were a matter of an isolatable system of operation." But he then suggests that, quote, "There's a need to study the system of human production and consumption within a much larger framework." In fact, Bataille scales that larger framework all the way up to the sun. As the quote on screen you see points out, man is the most suited of all living beings to consume intensely, sumptuously the excess energy offered up by the pressure of life, befitting the solar origins of its movement. The question of excess and what any system does with the excess energy or information in it is what Bataille is committed to. So once again, this image of the river meanders, the Mississippi River meanders. Our planet indexically thinking, the material systems bundling together different temporalities, creating feedback loops that we essentially ride on top of. The Earth itself registering massive addressability across countless millions of years. Or on a faster time scale, the anabatic and the katabatic, the typical flows of air across the warming cycle of a day, driven by solar energy, by ground temperatures, humidity. What would it mean for us to think mind itself as a tangle of upstream and downstream flows, and the sheaf of times, as Michel Serres calls it, as a will to move against the grain, to work against and with gravity, a unique figure in practice to meditate on these feedback loops, on what constitutes mind within these feedback loops. And perhaps what we can look for in these flows would be a reimagined concept of anabasis.
Keep your hands away from the guns.
And catabasis, the upstream and downstream journeys. Willard goes upstream in Apocalypse Now. The upstream and downstream are stitched together, myth and archetype across the geopolitics of the Vietnam War. It's a lens for us to scry a different flow of time and identity. And unfortunately, even war is a mode of planetary thinking at a macro historical scale. Of course, in Apocalypse Now, Kurtz knows that very, very well. And this anabatic journey upstream is not just a journey upriver or up the side of the mountain in the wind flow, but it leaps off planet and we set the controls for the heart of the sun. So again, how do we control these planet-scaled systems of coordination and thinking? The systems that exist outside the human, the natural, quote, natural systems, or the systems that humans create? How do we control our own systems, the systems we have created? This image by Chris Jordan of Midway, in the simplest sense, shows the feedback loops that are present between nature and artifice. These points of opportunity for us as designers to intervene. This image highlights their interdependence. The image, of course, is an image of an albatross or a seagull that has eaten a lot of plastic. It even ate a lighter, a Bic lighter. Now, the person who designed, or the team that designed that Bic lighter, was thinking about thumbs, human thumbs, how many hundreds or thousands of times the lighter would operate, how tall the flame would be, would the lighter explode, etc. How much did it cost to make? What was the return on investment for the company? I'm pretty sure the designer of that lighter never thought it would be eaten by an albatross and that it would kill an albatross. Nonetheless, it did. And the concept of design as an act of futuring, which we can extract from Tony Fry, is operational here. But instead of it being an act of futuring in the sense that, oh, the lighter can light a lot of things 1,000 times, it's an act of futuring in the sense that unintended aspects of that design keep on futuring. And this lighter futured its way into the albatross and killed the albatross. So this was an opportunity for design. It was a failure in the feedback loop. Or at least if you're interested in saving albatrosses and seagulls, it was a failure. But let's take the optimistic view again from Aldo Leopold's Sand County Almanac. Leopold says, quote, "It is an irony of history that the great powers should have discovered the unity of nations at Cairo in 1943. The geese of the world have had that notion for a longer time, and each march, they stake their lives on its essential truth. In the beginning, there was only the unity of the ice sheet, then followed the unity of the March thaw, and the northward hegira of the international geese. Every March since the Pleistocene, the geese have honked unity from China Sea to Siberian steppe, from Euphrates to Volga, from Nile to Murmansk. By this international commerce of geese, the waste corn of Illinois is carried through the clouds to the Arctic tundras, there to combine with the waste sunlight of a nightless June to grow goslings for all the lands between. And in this annual barter of food for light and winter warmth for summer solitude, the whole continent receives as net profit a wild poem dropped from the murky skies upon the muds of March." So the geese have known for a very long time what we only remind ourselves of repeatedly. If we look back to 1972 and Donella Meadows and her team, the Limits to Growth study, we see these problems, these questions mapped out in harsh light. Again, planetary horizons in terms of resources, growth, expenditure, development, agriculture, population, industry. Prediction and models were used here as a way to navigate and avoid precisely what Chris Jordan's image of the albatross reveals as a process well underway and out of control. What did Limits to Growth try to unpack? Their general diagram of system models tried to grasp feedback loops. They said, quote, "Our world model was built specifically to investigate 5 major trends of global concern: accelerating industrialization, rapid population growth, widespread malnutrition, depletion of non-renewable resources, and a deteriorating environment. These trends are all interconnected in many ways, and their development is measured in decades or centuries rather than in months or years. We are seeking to understand the causes of these trends, their interrelationships, and their implications as much as 100 years in the future." If we think about the problem of governance, we can also look back to the 70s. CyberSyn, 1971 to 73 in Chile. How do we respond to a set of predictions that we might pull out of the Club of Rome and Limits to Growth? Well, we could deploy a cybernetic mode of governance, infrastructure, and technology, providing an antidote to the human inability to perceive larger scopes of time. Again, this is a technicity installed as a form of control of those systems at different scales, which we can't usually grasp fully. Stafford Beer argued in a 1964 lecture before the CyberSyn project, quote, "The online control computer ought to be sensorially coupled to events in real time, to measure the real-time happiness of the entire Chilean nation in response to decisions made in the operations room." Another model which is seemingly more sinister, or at least until 2020 seemed more sinister, is the scenario Michael Winterbottom presents us in the film Code 46, where ubiquitous surveillance and tracking attempts to preserve all global citizens' health, while at the same time it imbricates the mechanisms of capital and control at an omnipresent level. In Code 46, it's a world very similar to our own. Slight differences. Empathy viruses exist. Almost perfect global security system exists. Genetic manipulation and cloning exists. Memory erasure exists. They all work together for the benefit and safety of society at large. And certainly, I think, for the many years I've shown this film, we always saw it as a dystopian vision. But in 2020, it doesn't necessarily seem so dystopian. And indeed, one of the points I always made in discussing this film was, would there be a situation wherein Code 46 would be the best possible outcome as a design scenario? And indeed, we find ourselves in that scenario. The writer Matthew Diabatua has written in his incredible novel, The Destructives, about these problems of the relationship between life and data. He says, the story of how life became data, and this is a science fiction scenario also, the story of how life became data is also the story of how data became alive. The quantified self movement had used scent receptors, embedded cameras, microphones, galvanic skin sensors, micro GPS, and so on. Every beat of the heart was tagged with a probability that it would be the last beat of that heart. Algorithms inferred likely outcomes from patterns within the stream and initiated the appropriate stimulation to the subject, to the user. Although the term user was misleading as it suggested agency on behalf of the subject. And I imagine this passage, if you're not familiar with it, rings very deeply for you right now in the world that we are currently living in. So how can we compass these systems, these structures of feeling? How can we articulate an engagement with resistance, control, across these previously isolated and episodic organs of a neurobiopolitical landscape? Liam Young's Unknown Field Division documentary project tries to take this on by revealing the economies, the networks of feeling, energy flow, and information that are operational in a sapphire mine that is simply human beings with shovels forming a human conveyor belt. This is one kind of structured feeling and one technicity. Much as Alexander Kojève understood that metasystem stability could catalyze a kind of a distillation of historical consciousness or a nullification of it, we know that the spheres of the neurophysiological, the biopolitical, the temporalities of culture and technology are in a tight series of feedback loops with each other. Think about Black Mirror's explorations of our present mediascape. To quote Benjamin Bratton here, where should sovereignty reside if not in what is in between us, derived not from each of us individually, but from what draws the world through us? Our ontologies have always been produced via collective intelligence. Maybe this is the implication of deep address. And of course, that connects back to the Carl Schroeder concept of thalience that I outlined a few minutes ago. So we would radically question foundational human principles for organizing our physical and political worlds. We would see both a truly post-human produced by the stack. We would imagine a collision between these ontologies and emergent forms of governance. Of course, this is what Benjamin Bratton's work has been brilliantly unpacking for years now. And perhaps these abyssal dark ecologies would consume us, or perhaps like Stanislav Lem's novel Solaris and the films of it, they would somehow recognize us. In any case, Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto is relevant as always. She says, by the late 20th century, our time, a mythic time, we're all chimeras, theorized and fabricated hybrids of machine and organism. In short, we are cyborgs. Well, I said nothing human makes it out of the near future. And I was quoting that infamous passage from Nick Land in the CCRU. I quote it again. Stanley Kubrick's vision is a kind of moment of hope. It imagines a generous alien upgrade and the Star Child's contemplation of Earth at the end of 2001. It says maybe there is some future in our dreaming. But our future after a failed grasp at general economies might not be able to escape from this scenario. When we consider intelligence and coordination might simply be purposeless exploitation. In 1968, Kubrick said this in an interview, right around the time 2001 was finishing production. He said, I'm interested in the argument of Professor Freeman Dyson of Princeton's Institute of Advanced Study, who contends that it would be a mistake to expect that all potential space visitors will be altruistic, or to believe that they would have any ethical or moral concepts comparable to mankind's. Dyson writes, if I remember him correctly, that intelligence may indeed be a benign influence, but it's just as likely that intelligence may be a cancer of purposeless technological exploitation, sweeping across a galaxy as irresistibly as it has swept across our own planet. We must be prepared for either possibility and conduct our searches accordingly. Now, that seems like it's pointed at alien intelligence, and of course it is, because Kubrick 2001, Freeman Dyson, and that entire conversation. But it's also pointed at a question of I and thou, you and I, in conversation human to human. It's a question of feedback loops and gestures. Human to animal, human to non-human, human to AI, human to planet, human to alien. And this gets me closer to the question of cosmopolitics. And to return to the question of cognition, thought as non-thought, thalience, sapience. So far I've been talking about timescales, planetary systems, infrastructures, information flow, ecological models, the relation between the human and the non-human. In all of these cases, a radically non-human concept of thinking, I would argue, is a foundation and articulates the line between sapience in organic and human systems and non-human systems. And it also underscores what kind of ethics might be possible in those relations. So I've asked a number of times, how can we intervene? And I've shown some attempts at intervention. I ask again, how can we intervene? What instrumentality might be available to us to bootstrap systems and thought? Of course, Freeman Dyson and Kubrick pointed out that accelerated intelligence might just be a cancer across the galaxy. But let's say for a moment that it might not be. How can we resist some of the imprisoning vectors I've sketched out? How can we resist the dark cosmopolitics of Speer hijacking Antonin Artaud's insights into affect? Let's think about Vertov's Man with a Movie Camera. This film is a film which has a set of feedback loop structures built across it. It's a film about daily life, Soviet daily life, 1927, 28, 29. But it's also a film about how to make a film. It's a film about how to see a film. And in fact, in the film, we see people making the film repeatedly. And here we see the editor in her editing room, cutting and joining film. We see the sprockets. We see footage that we have seen before. And then we see the footage moving. We see footage, in fact, that we will see later in the film, frozen, frame by frame, and then we see that footage moving. And so not only do we see this footage still and animated in this sequence, but we see it spread out across the entire film. And that deploys our mind forward in time and backwards in time to other experiences that the film itself is a kind of an envelope around. It's a model for recursivity, which produces a certain kind of consciousness. Perhaps we could argue sapience. Perhaps we could argue it's even an interesting proto-technicity for thalience. What does Deleuze say in his cinema books about Vertov? Deleuze says, quote, Vertov himself defined the cine-eye. It is that which couples together any point whatsoever of the universe in any temporal order whatsoever. And ultimately, the implication of Vertov's dream would be that every component of reality, down to the molecular scale and beyond, would speak in montage to every other component. Again, Carl Schroeder's idea of thalience unfolds along this line. Remember, Schroeder said that, quote, in an attempt to give the physical world itself a voice, so that rather than us asking what reality is, reality itself could tell us. The self-awareness of a planetary system, we often of Gaia, if you will, from Lovelock's concept, it might be utterly inaccessible to the human mind when all things have a name and a voice and an address and speak to each other, yet Vertov was in a way attempting to initiate this kind of system. And so this brings me to cosmopolitics, and I'll very briefly talk about these four provisional categories of cosmopolitics: neutral to dark, to orthogonal to empathic. Why cosmopolitics? Because simply our near future will include the challenge of not only communicating effectively with other humans, as I said, something we're notoriously bad at, but also communicating with AI and a wide range of complex systems that are fundamentally alien, even if they exist on our planet already. To what degree should we mourn the loss of our existing definitions of the human? Kojève said, the disappearance of man at the end of history is not a cosmic catastrophe. The natural world remains what it has been from all eternity. What disappears is man properly so called. This, I would say, is a neutral cosmopolitics. It's at peace with almost anything. Another neutral cosmopolitics, Primo Levi, having survived the death camps in World War II, quote, "We are alone. If we have interlocutors," and this is Primo Levi looking out into the universe, "if we have interlocutors, they are so far away that barring unforeseeable turns of events, we shall never talk to them. In spite of this, some years ago, we sent them a pathetic message. The universe is not made for human beings. It is hostile, violent, alien. In the sky, there are no Elysian fields, only matter and light, distorted, compressed, dilated, and rarefied to a degree that eludes our senses and our language." That sounds very dark, but it isn't. It's neutral because everything is so far away that we will never, in human possibility, be able to reach it, them. It's a neutral cosmopolitics. We can imagine them. A dark cosmopolitics. In the dark context, there's an implication that in energy poor and resource poor systems, which of course all systems are to some extent, and this is what Robin Hanson talks about when he talks about the hardscrapple frontier, in energy poor systems, a first strike will always be necessary. This is what Cixin Liu unpacks in The Dark Forest in his trilogy, the cosmological axiom that we discover in his trilogy. In one scenario, in fact, in Dark Forest, we see several Earth spaceships fleeing from Earth after an alien attack. The ships simultaneously realize that since they're going on a multi-thousand-year voyage, running away from Earth, they'll need to cannibalize parts and resources from each other. This means that only one ship really can continue, and it leads to a first strike. This is just a mirror of the universal law that demands first strike cosmopolitics. It's bleak for those who do not survive, but it's framed by Cixin Liu in this particular attack and by the main character Zhang Beihai at that moment in the attack against the lens of the survival of a species or a general principle of life itself. This is a dark cosmopolitics. And then an orthogonal cosmopolitics. And again, I just want to remind you that in each of these examples, we should be thinking of opportunities for design, opportunities for intervention. At what scale would we intervene? At what scale would we develop an intentionality to intervene? Yes? Now we can jump to an orthogonal cosmopolitics. What does this mean? Well, Hugo de Guerra says that in speaking of the very, very, very small, femto, atto, zepto, as one scales down in general, performance levels increase dramatically. And Hugo de Guerra means computational performance increases dramatically. So the hyperintelligences billions of years older than we are in our universe have probably downscaled. In other words, shrunk themselves down to achieve hugely greater performance levels. Civilizations living inside volumes the size of nucleons or smaller. This is what you could call a shadow biosphere, but a really, really small one. Not one that you find living at 3 parasite levels down inside an insect. This is orthogonal life outside the constraints of competition. They're not in competition with us, and we're not in competition with them. They might not even know we exist. It's like Greg Bear's novel, Blood Music. Another orthogonal cosmopolitics, maybe a little bit harder to imagine as orthogonal, could be found in the 2 beautiful films that Alex Garland directed, his adaptation of Vandermeer's novel Annihilation and his earlier Ex Machina. Especially Annihilation holds many of the core concepts from the original novel, which are meditations on a profound gesture between the human and the non-human. Humans merging with the radically non-human in such a way that we could contemplate it without too much fear. And these scenarios are precisely that, a shedding of the human diagram, yet a preservation of something of the dignity, something of the form of life, which all creatures as low entropy intelligences share, and we humans among those low entropy systems.
We should go, Josie. How long was your husband in the shimmer? It's hard to say exactly. Theoretically, as long as a year. us a long time to be inside and remain intact. Not so sure it was intact. I'm right about the refractions, aren't I? Yeah. I checked my blood last night. It's in me. It will be in all of us. It was so strange hearing Shepard's voice in the mouth of that creature last night. I think as she was dying, part of her mind became part of the creature that was killing her. Imagine dying frightened and in pain and having that as the only part of you which survives. I wouldn't like that at all. Ventress wants to face it. You want to fight it. But I don't think I want either of those things. Josie. Josie. Josie!
And so perhaps that's an orthogonal cosmopolitics, but perhaps it's even already an empathic cosmopolitics. But this brings me finally to the place where planet and human, gesture and mind, upstream and downstream might all meet. Both Villeneuve's Arrival and Tarkovsky's Mirror deal with the scaling from the human and the planetary through networks and infrastructures which make the massive addressability of a synesthetic gesture possible, up to the cosmopolitical. So addressing the scope of the humanly political and the intimate fragility of our being simultaneously. Of course, in both films, the linguistics of the feedback loop in consciousness, and the question, is it possible to scale this to a population? Well, we saw with Artaud and with Speer that certainly it's possible to scale it to a population, but to scale it in another way to a population. Coordination comes back here again. What is a gesture? So from Giorgio Agamben, Notes on the Gesture in Means Without End, the gesture, quote, the gesture opens the sphere of ethos as the more proper sphere of that which is human and is communication of a communicability. It's not a signal to noise ratio where you get the message. It's a very lossy communication system. And deliberately so, because the gesture is not so much about communicating exactly the message, but it's communication, that communication is possible. That communication is being attempted. But with all due respect to Agamben, it should be revised to state that low entropy intelligences, sapiences, thaliences even, are the being that the gesture is most suited to, not the human. The human is a subset of that category. And implicit in this are feedback loops at various scales. So I've shown images of the desert, sort of. I'll show some more images from Mobius's 40 Days dans le Desert B, and talk about recursive systems and thinking. How can the individual think the self to the point where the self nears annihilation, yet is not destroyed, but is reinvented? Is that what we saw in the clip from Annihilation? As Schrödinger says, consciousness finds itself intimately connected with and dependent on the physical state of a limited region of matter, the body. Okay. My question here would be twofold. Is there a kind of slow-moving mind produced in some of these actions, non-human but capable of cognition, perhaps across millennia? Think of the tectonic plates image of Africa that I showed. One of the lingering questions provoked for me by this idea is the challenge it raises vis-a-vis identifying limits of bodies. Think about the example from Stones of Venice, the Ruskin text that I read while we were flying over Venice. Is the architectural style itself the body? Or are the stones themselves of Venice the geologically scaled bodies which we should consider? Or is it the flickering non-human life and mind of the city of Venice itself, the culture over hundreds of years? Is that the mind? And Schrodinger again. Schrodinger says, a living organism continually increases its entropy, or as you may say, produces positive entropy, and thus tends to approach the dangerous state of maximum entropy, which is of death. It can only keep aloof from it, that is alive, by continually drawing from its environment negative entropy, which is something very positive, as we shall immediately see. What an organism feeds upon is negative entropy. Think about deserts. Yes, of course, we can think about Dune again here. Think about deserts, but think about points of intervention. Organisms themselves are already points of intervention in this design problem. That's what Schrodinger is saying. Schrodinger continues by saying this, quote, or to put it less paradoxically, the essential thing in metabolism is that the organism succeeds in freeing itself from all the entropy it cannot help producing while alive. So I'd like to conclude with a few comments on gesture. This set of beautiful quotes from Nandita Biswas-Malamfi's text on Dune, which she titled Terra and Terror Ecology, Secrets from the Arquine Underground. This beautiful text unpacks Dune much more insightfully and eloquently than I ever possibly could. But let me read some of Nandita's comments here. She says, gestural ecology is best understood in the context of a predator-prey ecology engineered to track, trap, and hook worm movement across given expanses. The hook also happens to be the very technical device that permits humans to interact directly with the underground spice-producing sandworms of Arrakis. The hook of gesture becomes the elusive stratagem of an ecological perspective that uses the interaction of elemental movements across a landscape, that is sand and water, as bait to track, trap, and eventually manipulate, change that landscape. In other words, to terraform, to track, trap, and manipulate spice-producing sandworms. The gestural framework of ecological notation, its hook-like mechanism, and of course she means that in many different ways, is what enables this science to track, localize, translate, decompose components so as to identify and manipulate mechanisms of activity and transcribe movement across landscapes. Ecological notation, or gestural diagrammatology, thus becomes an interventionist science, as well as the normative basis for the cultural transmission of ecological literacy and religious obedience amongst the population. When the post-planetary design groups and I spoke about Dune, we often talked about designing languages, designing educational and pedagogical systems, designing cultures. And this is what Nandita's pointing out, but she's pointing out that it also connects back to the hook and the precise way that the sand rider's hook pulls the segment of the worm back to irritate the worm so that the worm rolls to rotate up, and as the worm rolls to rotate up, sliding through the desert sands, the sand rider is carried up to the top of the worm. It's a technicity that operates on many, many different scales. So this concept of anabasis again, we're interested in a relationship between models of energy flow, event, and mind across material and biological systems. And I'm asking in a very speculative way, can bios and zoe, human, non-human, inorganic life all together as a network of cohabitations, be understood through relations that we can seek or invoke or implement between forms of life, an ever-growing taxonomy of species of thought, a general economy of modes of mind, a cosmopolitics. So we can take a deep breath here because this has been an enormous amount of material. And I'll conclude with Tarkovsky and Arrival, just asking you to think about the human in the equation, or the cognitive system, or the feeling system in the equation, the sapient or the thalient system in the equation, the feedback loops. Tarkovsky's film, Mirror, was a film which built those feedback loops much in the same way as Vertov's Man with a Movie Camera. The doublings and the repetitions in Tarkovsky's film, the overlaps, the characters playing multiple characters, Tarkovsky's own mother playing the grandmother in the film. Terakova playing both his mother as a young woman, Maria, and his ex-wife, Natalia, and the house being rebuilt. So I'll conclude with this filmic collision, this meditation on what might constitute a self-bootstrapping, empathic cosmopolitical gesture, by placing a passage from Tarkovsky's Mirror into contact with Villeneuve's Arrival. Thinking always about design interventions, system feedback loops.
Louise. I am Louise.
Sir, Donnelly is taking off his hazmat suit. Permission to abort? Continue the session.
Louise. I am Louise.
Sir, Donnelly is taking off his hazmat suit. Permission to abort? Continue the session.
I think those are their names.
So what are we gonna call them?
I don't know.
So, closing comment on coordination. Our existing concepts and tools of coordination, and some that I've tried to outline, are planets across billions of years, give way today to forms of technologically mediated and produced coordination. This is the design challenge we face as we turn into the strong wind of the century we are 1/5 of the way into. Ultimately, I hope these questions reconfigure our relation with non-human thought, ethics, and ontologies. The concept of the gesture as an information-rich but untranslatable act of communication returns ever more powerfully, but it doesn't lead toward many recognizable models of the human. Though I've drawn this idea of coordination in part from science fiction, it's just as applicable to the frameworks of emerging AI, artificial general intelligence, artificial superintelligence, or the biopolitics of attentional capture we now live in. There's no difference between learning to communicate with an AI, with a non-human, a baby, or an alien. We must adapt. And indeed, gesture may be the only true mode of translation we have ever had, the only mode we can have. To rephrase Gertrude Stein, I like the feeling of gestures doing what they want to do and as they have to do. Thanks. See if we can return to taking questions now.
Thanks, Ed. Yeah, we're going to open up the Q&A, and I see we already have a couple of questions in the chat, so that's really fantastic. We're going to unmute you one at a time, let you address your question. We'll probably try and limit back and forth too much so we can get everyone in. In the meantime, if you have a question, please pop it in the chat so we can get you in there, and we'll pass it over.
Great. Can you guys see me and hear me?
Yes, but you're still sharing your screen, Ed.
Very good. Thanks. Let me stop that. And that was a super dense talk. I tried, as I said to the team before I started, tried to throw the kitchen sink in as well as everything. So thank you very much for going along for the ride on that one.
Siron, I believe, if I'm mispronouncing that, I apologize. You're unmuted. You can ask your question if you'd like.
Hi, yeah, so basically, I watched the new Japanese director, actually, I think it came out last year, but basically it's the Children of the Sea movie. And I think a lot of the concepts in the movie deals greatly with today's lecture, which at one point the character says that essentially like all the biological lives on Earth are made of the same materials as the stars in the universe. And then, so like if everything is birthed from the same thing and then dies back to the same thing,
Yes.
like this is like a huge feedback loop in itself, and like also covering a bunch of little feedback loops. So I was wondering, like, if everything kind of like recycles itself, like where are we going with this? And like, I wanted to hear your thoughts.
Sure, sure. I mean, on one level, I think it's a personal decision for each of us to either take comfort in that idea or to be terrified by it, or maybe both, because it is both terrifying. Who was it, Pascal, that said the silence of infinite space terrifies me? But it's also incredibly comforting to know that these are just enormous cycles. As Joni Mitchell said, you know, we're star stuff, we're golden. And I'll never cease adoring Joni for everything she did and played and sang and wrote. But it maybe especially for trying to articulate that as well. But I do think that individual choice as an actor in the world, as a designer or whatever your practitioner is what comes into play. And then it's up to you to decide what there is to do. Che fare, what is it to be done? It's not just a political question to say, wow, shit is fucked up and broken. What can we do? Of course it's that question, but it's another question, which is knowing what you just articulated, Siron, what you just said as an idea. If you hold that seriously as a possibility, then those kinds of cycles render everything equivalent, and any action is equal to any other action. And so then it becomes a very interesting philosophical question and moral and ethical question. What is to be done? And for me, I'm so glad that you raised that, because that's one of the questions that I always ask, and that I would hope would emerge out of a kind of a crazy, you know, everything in the kitchen sink talk like this, would be to say, well, how can then we frame, how can we build decision frameworks, knowing those kinds of things? And I also remember having a conversation years ago with the philosopher Manuel de Landa, who I'm sure some of you are familiar with his work. And we were talking about, I think we might have been talking about Bruno Latour, and no offense to Bruno Latour or Bruno Latour's followers, but Manuel got quite riled up. And at a certain point in the discussion, he visibly frustrated said, but oxygen is fucking real, man. Like, we know how oxygen works. Now, of course, if you're a philosopher, you could say, well, yes, that's all well and good, but our senses and our instruments report back to us on one reality. But as Carl Schroeder pointed out, there could be other realities that our senses and our instruments don't report back on. But given the framework of the reality that we're in, if we're non-naive realists, we do know that oxygen's real and it works. And we learn more about it every day, but we also know how to do a lot of things with oxygen, and we know what it does. And so it seems to me that keeping a sense of humor while still being deadly serious about the question, what is to be done, that's, for me, that's my attempt to approach the point that you raise. We know that we have an incomplete model or picture of how things work, which is why I raised Thalience and Cross-Schroeder's idea of Thalience and the models that he deploys, and a kind of a radically imbricated and disseminated ontology. But we also know how to make certain things happen. And then perhaps it could default back to a question of dignity and compassion, empathy. Those are all hard things to unpack. They have to be unpacked. But as humans, we understand dignity and pain and safety, compassion. And we can share those feelings with non-human actors, whether they're other animals or other life forms, plant forms. So yes, it's projection. I know I'm projecting. I project onto the earthworm. I project onto the bat. What is it like to be a bat? How can we know? But we can be fairly sure that bats feel pain. And so perhaps that's a starting point to build a decision framework around not doing harm. I remember that line in one of the Ghost in the Shell movies. All I desired was to be an elephant living in the jungle free, doing harm to no one. Maybe that's a starting point too. But it seems to me that there needs to be a starting point that's in constant dialogue with itself and with the world around it, that recognizes that perhaps all acts are equal, yet nonetheless in a universe where all acts might be equal, there still are singularities, there still are pleasures and pains, injustices, dignities, etc.
Great, thank you. And we've got another question from Yvonne, who I will try to unmute. If one of the other hosts, there we go.
Yep, am I unmuted?
Yes.
Hey, Yvonne.
Hey, thanks for the talk. That was a great talk. In the beginning of the talk, you brought up the idea of scale and thinking across scale, or designing across scale. And I was kind of interested in how design deals with, in a lot of cases you have systems, and I'm thinking primarily of physics, but there are many other examples of it, where you have at different scales, very different regimes of language, very different ontologies, and very different frameworks to deal with the different scales. And of course, you could design within those spaces and just keep them separate and keep the thinking around them separate. But of course, they overlap. They kind of bleed into one another, and there are these kind of regime shifts between them. In physics, between like the cosmological scale, where gravity is very much the force that kind of makes the most sense to organize and structure things in terms of the quantum mechanical scale, which is incommensurate with it on even a theoretical level, and then this kind of like middle scale. And these aren't, exclusive, but nevertheless, it, gives one instance. Like another instance would be in economics, where you have the microeconomical processes and the macroeconomical processes, and then this shift that you have to go through when you go from one to the other. So how does design deal with those kinds of boundaries between these ontologies or between these regimes of functioning?
That's a great question. I think that I would say first it's up to the designer to educate themselves as intensively, with as much curiosity and passion and cross-disciplinarity as they can. Simply because, take it as an example, a subway system. Well, it's like the image from Chris Jordan's Midway image of the albatross. Someone designed a lighter to do certain things, but the lighter went on to do other things. And the design was an act of futuring. It futured badly for the albatross, but it probably futured fine for the person who used the lighter a few hundred times. Think of subway system. You might do a set of calculations by taking a model of fluid dynamics to make sure that you don't have too much of a crowd on a subway platform at peak commute hour. And you might, as an architect or as an engineer, adjust the scale of the subway platform to make sure that even with massive peak commute bodies on the platform, you're not going to have an accident. And so as a designer, you're looking at the platform, the scale of the platform and all the design moves, the materials, lines of sight, circulation, all of that. And you're saying, okay, I got to optimize this. And I'm going to use a model from fluid dynamics to say, this will give me an accurate description of how bodies organize when they're flowing on a platform. And maybe you'll design a platform that actually is excellent, both from the person's experience on the platform, but it also doesn't create accidents, and it can handle Very few people and very many people. Okay, fine. So let's say that you're the military and you're doing an experiment testing how airflow in a subway system can carry viral particles through the subway system. And so you take a non-lethal but contagious agent and you put it in small glass vials and you drop them in New York City on the subway tracks in various locations, and you track who gets sick over the next 2 weeks based on airflow. Now that's a design problem too. And there are a lot of different scales to that design problem. One is choosing the infectious agent so that it doesn't hurt people, which is presumably what they did. Another is choosing how to stage the operation and how to come up with an appropriate set of measurements to understand really how the experiment worked, how to measure airflow across an entire city subway system, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Same subway system also could utilize the tools of fluid dynamics. Totally different design agenda, totally different scale of consequences. And so I guess the point I'm making here is the designers of the experiment on contagion in a subway system versus the designers who just want to make sure that you don't have an accident on a crowded platform. They both think that they're designing a subway system or they're interacting with certain parameters of design in the subway system. But rarely the twain shall meet in terms of the vocabulary of what they think they're doing, other than perhaps sharing an interest in fluid dynamics at certain scales to handle flow in a system like that. And so I hope you see the point I'm making, that two different design briefs, two different design teams, two different design team outcomes, same location, and that happens all the time. And so my argument as a designer would be to simply say, we have to be attentive to the fact that that historically has happened all the time and ask what we can do about it. And in some cases, just say, hey, there's nothing I can do about it. Like, let's say I'm an architect and I'm really interested in a certain proportion of design on a building facade because I like the geometry and I like the material and I'm interested in how I treat stone to receive metal and wood, which then can receive glass. Because those things all operate across 50 years or 100 years with different chemical reactions to each other and different expansion coefficients, et cetera, different ways of weathering. But what I'm really interested in is the proportion of the design. So I geek out a little bit on the materials interaction with each other, but then I'm like, okay, I can hand this off to somebody else. I really don't care about whether it's wood or metal in the window treatment. What I really care about is how this facade is handled, because it's going to change the experience of the people in the building as they look out of the building into the urban environment. And what I'm most interested in is how the person in the building situates themselves over a 5-year period as they pass that window every day over 5 years. Maybe it's an office space. And I want to draw their attention, both consciously and subconsciously, to a vast scale that's outside the local scale of the building. And so I use the window system geometrically, proportionally, in terms of scale and transparency to handle that problem. I don't give a damn whether it's a wood mullion system or an aluminum mullion system. I'm like, yeah, I understand they have their ups and downs, they have their pros and cons, but really it's about the line of sight over 5 years and an audience that largely will not even know that the design move was put in place for them to have their mode of perceiving both local space and urban space inflected. And so I hope you see what I'm driving at. Like, as an architect, my move there would be decoupled from a whole range of other questions that are actually urgent to the functioning of the building. Like, let's say the building I'm designing is a 30-story tall office and residential mixed-use building. And I'm taking into account, again, these different habits of occupation that might form over multiple years. And so I'm trying to design the building to accommodate those and inflect the quality of life of people who are both working and living in the building. But I haven't talked one bit about energy efficiency yet, right? And so if you pull another designer or another architect into the conversation, they'll be like, cool, your argument sounds great, but it's totally bankrupt morally and ethically because you've avoided the problem of how much energy it costs to build your building, to maintain your building, to de-assemble your building at the end of its lifespan, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so, of course, I would have to agree with that critic. I'd have to say, you're right, I haven't talked about that yet. I'd like to think about that. I need to deal with that. But of course, in the real world, oftentimes those conversations are utterly decoupled. And so I would argue the good designer is the designer that tries to take all of those things on and understands the interrelationships between them, or at the very least, sandboxes the ones that they feel are the ones they want and need to take on in that project. You know, it's not like you can design a computer interface and solve all the challenges of the world, even if you know where all of those materials were horribly unethically extracted and all of the labor horribly unethically extracted to produce the technology that we're now using right now to communicate with each other. But you might be able to inflect through interface design, software or hardware interface design a little bit, the way that people become aware of those questions. And so that's how I would orbit the point that you're bringing up. It's really hard. It's especially hard in a pedagogical context because, you know, even if you have this conversation over 15 weeks or an entire year or 3 years, at the end of the conversation, all of us, both, quote, teachers, professors, and students, designers, practitioners, we all face the same problem, is that you just can't take on all of those things. And so it becomes almost a wicked problem that's unsolvable, and that's too much of a challenge. That's too much of a challenge. And so by offering this hope that we can all be as truly interdisciplinary as possible, I also don't want to foreclose the possibility that someone's going to come out of the conversation and say, wow, I heard everything that you said, and I understand that operation in different disciplines is sandboxing. We're trying to overcome that sandboxing, but at the same time, this is the problem I want to take on. I just want to design a guitar. I just want to design a guitar that people love to play. I spent a lot of time, as Weston, I think, pointed out, around guitar designers and guitar builders and guitarists in the past 10 years and longer. And I empathize with that. I just want to build guitars too. And building it, you could say, okay, well, build guitars out of sustainable materials, build them out of reused materials. Yes, I'm with you on that. But maybe what you just want to do is build some guitars that are really, really good, the way they sound really good. And that's okay too. So it's up to you as the designer to both understand the interaction across as many different disciplines as you possibly can, to understand your own limitations. Like, I'm not an advanced mathematician. I just can't handle the math. And I've lamented this for years to all of my seminar participants. I wish I had the math that someone like Ben Goertzel has, you know, or Lisa Randall. I wish I had the math that those people have. So I see my limitations. I can't go there. Unfortunately, for certain mathematicians and physicists, if they hear my lectures, they might actually say, wow, that's great, Ed, but like, you can't go any further with your lectures now because you're not a mathematician and a physicist, and that's what's really holding you back. And that might be true. I might be the expert generalist, as architects have sometimes called themselves, and that might be my Achilles heel. But in any case, I try to be the expert generalist to the best that I can, and that would be to articulate the points that I just articulated, Yvonne, to the point that you raised, which is extremely important. Know your limits, try to go beyond them as much as possible, be aware that you can choose the remit of the design problem that you're taking on. Maybe try to work with teams of other people who are truly experts in other domains that you're not, and learn from them so that you can take on more in the design challenges.
Yeah, it sounds like interdisciplinarity is very important, kind of declaring the regimes of scale that you're familiar with so other people can kind of interject if necessary and collaborate with you in productive ways and help you see like other scales that you might just not be as familiar with or as acquainted with.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, great, thank you. We have another comment, one more question from Cade. Cade, you can go ahead and unmute yourself when you're ready.
Cool, thank you very much. Yeah, so just, I wanted to ask, you mentioned how bad we are at communicating with each other when discussing the needs for a means of communicating with the non-human. And I just wanted to get some of your thoughts, like how do you think cosmopolitics would affect, specifically improve already existing communication systems between humans? And as I was writing this, I realized that you do kind of bring up that up in the example of, I can't remember his name, but the Nazi architect
Speer,
hijacking, Speer, who hijacking Artaud's idea. But if maybe you could just kind of expound on that a little.
Well, you know, I tried to map out 3 provisional cosmopolitics back in 2015, so loosely touching on the work of other people who are so far beyond this, Isabel Stengers or Dejan Lukic, people who've worked on cosmopolitics for an incredibly long period of time. And so my initial stab at it, coming out of the material that I know very well, was to try to juxtapose the dark, the neutral, and the orthogonal. The empathic sounds like a kind of a Hail Mary appeal to feel good. And in a way it was, because when I finished reading the Cixin Liu, for some reason at that moment in my life, it just cut more deeply than anything I had ever encountered. And I went back and reread the trilogy 3 times over, which was hard to do with our schedules, work, teaching, kids, etc. But I reread the trilogy between 1 in the morning and 4 in the morning over several years, in a hallucinatory state of delirium, probably. But
and maybe that helped.
It forced me to obliquely take on some of the problems, and the offering of the empathic was not to say naively, well, oh, empathy is always good because then we can somehow have co-feeling. Although striving for co-feeling as an act of like McLuhan-esque leaning forward cool media is certainly something that I would be interested in somehow championing or at least exploring. So I wouldn't offer, quote, cosmopolitics as a solution, but I would say that this totally provisional stab at these 4 silos of cosmopolitics was my attempt to say that pre-existing cosmopolitics, and in a way that's what Cixin Liu is talking about as well, pre-existing cosmopolitics are kind of models that we can look to and then find analogs, isomorphisms to, both in our human politics, whether it's laws, economies, cultures, or human to non-human or non-human to non-human systems, right? So I'm always looking for a kind of universalist model that, hopefully without being too loose or too reductionist or too, you know, all-encompassing, can be translated across scales. It's the old, you know, tempest in the teacup, milk in your coffee, red spot on Jupiter kind of problem. Is it really formally operating similarly? Or does it just look like it's operating similarly? And then to go deeper into that to understand the principles of how each system is operating. And so the dark, the orthogonal, the cosmopolitics, the empathic cosmopolitics, the neutral cosmopolitics, those are all like starting point terms to try to come to grips with what Cixin Liu offered with the dark forest example, which is, as you know, as I pointed out in the talk, it is a first strike argument. And the trilogy unpacks that all the way to its most horribly logical end on a literally a galactic scale. And it's the trilogy ends beautifully with a very strong moment of hope, incredibly poignant, beautiful moment of hope. But to get there, you know, countless billions of lives are lost. So it's not a fun vision of the dark forest that Cixin Liu offers. And so what it offers there is more a set of observations of the universe from which partially universalist models of systems behavior can be abstracted, which then can be redeployed in systems, human systems. You know, it's the Artaud example is Artaud looking at snakes and kind of not actually really understanding how snakes work. It isn't the vibrations, it's the movement of the snake charmer that hypnotizes the snake. But the concept of affect is how it works. And it certainly is how it worked for Speer and how it works for us now. A kind of a society of the spectacle on steroids that we live in right now. And so I would be looking for models which allow us to grasp in precise scientific terms, for example, the human limit of perception. Something that Peter Watts, for example, relies upon heavily because he's a trained scientist, a marine biologist, and he relies on a vast body of work when he's writing his novels like Blindsight to substantiate the kind of wild, fantastic hard science fiction he writes by referring back to the way that animal organisms and human organisms actually do work, because we've studied exactly what the limits of perception are in human eye and human mind, speed of reaction, attentional limits, all of that stuff, for him to extrapolate what an alien cognition, an alien body might be, an alien cosmopolitics, and then what the human encounter with that might be. And so that's kind of where I keep looping back around through the cosmopolitics. It's not to say, wow, we need a cosmopolitics because that will help us solve all of these dilemmas of communication. It's more to say there are different configurations of systems interacting with other systems, which we might name politics, which we might then scale up and name cosmopolitics, which we then might also observe at a smaller scale, and which we then might draw some general conclusions about. It's what George Bataille tries to do in Part Maudit, A Cursed Share. You know, so I'm just following in those footsteps, and I'm not offering a happy answer. I'm hopeful, right? The question of communication and being bad at communication, also I want to underscore something. Like, unfortunately, humans are notoriously bad at communicating with each other. I'm not sure exactly what your question means, and you're not sure exactly what my answer or my lecture means. But we kind of triangulate around a common shared sense of meanings. And we're going to come away from that with curiosity about each other, which will lead, as Michel Serres puts it, through iteration, or as the Halperins, Anne and Lawrence Halperin put it, through their RSVP cycle as a kind of general model, will lead to certain stabilities of meaning, which is a form of communication, right? So we're not good at communicating, but we're actually not bad at communicating, even though we're bad at communicating. And I'm interested in that question of gesture, as Nandita unpacked it in her amazing text, also as Agamben unpacks it in his notes on the gesture, because it has something to do with recognizing that there's always a lack of signal in the communication channel. And if both the transmitter and the receiver know that, that's a starting point for an empathic cosmopolitics. And so we could be aware that we're bad at communicating, but it's okay. We're not going to eat each other or blow up each other's planets quite yet. We're going to lean forward and continue trying to do that. Again, it could be a naive hope, because the dark forest model could be the ruling model. I can't say. But hopefully that answers your question. Again, I'm not a pessimist about this. It's not that all humans communicate badly. I have a sense of humor. Like, how do we really know that we're communicating with each other? Well, we know that we don't know exactly that we're communicating with each other. This has been well rehearsed by philosophers and linguists and many, many people over several thousand years. But we can take that in stride and move forward with a sense of humor. Make sure that everyone's well fed and cared for and has less of an incentive to eat their neighbor. And then we don't have to worry quite so much about the bad communication.
Yeah. No, thank you very much. It's very helpful.
Thank you,
a lot of new info to come away with.
Thank you, Kate.
Thank you.
Great. And we have one more question from Mike. Mike, if you want to unmute yourself and ask when you're ready.
Thank you.
Mike.
Hi, how are you? Thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
You're clearly well versed on the topics. That's terrific. Thank you. You mentioned having children, so you get to have conversations with children about these topics.
With the oldest, who's 21 in a few weeks, many conversations. With the middle kid, who's 7, actually quite a few. He became an enormous fan of Kurzgesagt and It's Okay to Be Smart and a whole bunch of science channels, and he plays Minecraft obsessively. So there's a lot of conversations we have with him. With the youngest, she doesn't have many words yet, so not yet, but maybe soon.
With the 7-year-old, what's that conversation sound like?
Well, we saw The Matrix a few weeks ago, and there were a series of questions about Agent Smith and what the world of the Matrix was. And that was a hard one to explain, that the Matrix was a simulation that was run by the machine civilization and that humans were prisoners. So we spent a bunch of time talking about what it would mean for the humans to be imprisoned in that kind of system, and why that would happen, and why there would be traitors like Cypher, and what the struggle would be about. So that's going to be an ongoing conversation. That one, I think, has a tremendous depth to it. But that's one example. Yeah.
Have you had the opportunity to talk with other students, other age group students of that around 7 on any of this?
No. I mean, this has been a tough year for the kids because they've been
Absolutely.
in isolation since March. And
sure.
Yeah.
So has your 7-year-old made a contribution to your thinking?
Oh, great. Yes, maybe in the most easy answer, the things he designs and builds in Minecraft are so incredibly good that I just want to reboot our architecture firm and have him be the designer and just forget everything else. And it just will be, Sol will be the designer, and we'll just, we'll throw him at any commission we get and he'll design it, and that'll be it. He'll design it in Minecraft and we'll build it. Seriously, I just adore the stuff that he's doing, and it's incredible to see a kind of a fundamental pattern language, design vocabulary emerging in what he does. Like he started playing Minecraft seriously, I think, in February, and within just a few weeks, he was already building houses with parties, with program zones, with places that you would arrive and the things that you would do when you would arrive, and they were tailored to the Minecraft reality, so it wasn't, a normal house, but the partie of a normal house was clearly in a kind of, very deep, subliminal way, articulating through what he was building. And that was fascinating. It was really, really, really interesting to see that. So I've just been watching that for the past few months and loving it. And
so that was intuitive. Do you get to have a discussion with him about that?
Well, we talk about it all the time because, he'll have something new and we'll just, he'll show it to us. He'll be like, oh, you have to come see this new house that I built in this new world that I'm in right now. And so those conversations happen several times a week. Yeah. It's hard to articulate what I'm learning from that. I think there's a certain question of attention as an adult and like pretty normal stuff, just getting out of the normal cycles of articulating concept, receiving concept back, articulating concept, because he doesn't operate in those call and response cycles. It's more like a sudden data dump from him, and then we've got to be in it, checking it out together. Some of our architect friends like Ezio Blazzetti have spent time inside these worlds too. So Ezio has built some stuff in there for and with Solaris and so forth. So yeah.
Although that challenge that you just described parallels exactly with everything this entire talk.
Oh yes, totally, yes. Yeah.
Great. Well, we are getting pretty close to our ending time here, so I think we just would all like to really thank you, Ed, so much for this wonderful talk. For those of us who have had the honor of taking Postplanetary, this is like a very reaffirming and a great mode of thought to just continue on in our daily lives, and we thank you for sharing this all with us.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure, and congratulations on getting that group up and going. It will be fantastic, and thank you for the amazing questions and for so many people showing up. It's great to see some friends in here and also new people, so thank you so much.
Yeah, so I'm just going to send our info for the New School space. You can see our website there and our Twitter. Follow us through there. We also have Instagram, Facebook, all the usuals. Please do keep in touch. We will also have a recording of this video made available soon through YouTube, and I will post it there, and also we'll share the link with Ed, and we can all disperse as we want to.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Good night.
All.